The Scuttlebutt is proud to welcome Millerstown Pick Apart, a self-service salvage yard where you can get parts you need for your car, truck, or van at very attractive prices because you do the work. Bring your own wrenches, hammers, screwdrivers, sockets, jacks, drills, or whatever you need, except for torches, to wrestle out the parts you need for the vehicles in the yard. Millerstown Pick Apart was created 17 years ago to provide reasonably priced solutions for auto parts needs. Millerstown is the perfect fit for those seeking discount auto parts to repair their own vehicles. Millerstown has a huge inventory of cars, which they purchase from individuals, towing companies, and auctions, and from its sister auto salvage recycling operation. For hours, directions, inventory, parts availability, and pricing, you can go to pickapartyard.com. That's PICAPARTYARD, pickapartyard.com, or call 724-224-4777. That's pickapartyard.com or call 724-224-4777.
And eventually, I told him, I'm like, I'm not here to play gotcha. I'm here to tell your stories. And if I'm not here to tell it, then maybe no one will. Who knows? I mean, it's a big country. It's a lot of soldiers and not a lot of journalists. And I think your story is important.
Welcome, everyone, to Season 5 of The Scuttlebutt. My name is Sean Hall, the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club, whose mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. This is the first episode of Season 5, and if you've been with us this long, thank you so much for being a fan. And if this is your first time, please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube so you're the first to know whenever new episodes are released every Monday. We also love to hear from our fans, so you can email me at Sean, that's SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Or if you are listening to this through audio format, also know that there is a YouTube version of this podcast that you could just go right on and watch. And I do recommend that for this first episode of Season 5. Because our first guest is going to be freelance photojournalist Justin Merriman. Later on in the episode, we're going to show some of the images that Justin has been able to capture in all of his travels, and he's going to talk about some of them. So I definitely recommend you coming over to YouTube and watching on there. Back to Justin. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Time, USA Today, Sports Illustrated, and publications across the globe. All of his awards are listed in his bio on his website, which we will have here in the description, along with an organization which he started called American Reportage. I definitely recommend checking him out and checking out all of the incredible photos that he has, though we only were able to get to several of them here. We'll hear a bit about his story, how he got his start here in Pennsylvania, and what led him to then embed with the 101st Airborne in Afghanistan, that and beyond. There's a lot to get to in this episode. Joining me for this conversation will be fellow co-host Catherine Guyan. And I should mention that the Scuttlebutt was created by the Veterans Breakfast Club to help bridge the military-civilian divide by taking a look and trying to understand military culture through a civilian perspective, which is me. I'm not a veteran. I just have a passion for veteran stories, and so does Catherine. So I think you'll see that in the episodes to come this season. We have a lot of really great guests lined up for this whole season. So without further ado, let's get to our conversation with Justin Merriman. Thank you so much for joining us. So we're very excited to invite you here with us today, Justin. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Love to dive into our conversation today with Justin. Justin, I was so amazed looking at your website, seeing the pictures that you have captured and reading your bio about how you got started in photojournalism, and really wanted you to come on so that you could tell your story for our audience and break down some of the pictures, and then also talk a bit about an organization that you're involved in, American Reportage, which we'll get to later on in the program. But to start off, Justin, can you tell us a bit about how you got started?
Sure. I was a student at the University of Pittsburgh, Greensburg, and I was studying writing, primarily poetry writing and fiction writing. And I always had an interest in storytelling. And there was a opening for the school's newspaper, and I thought, well, I need a credit. That sounds interesting. I joined the paper staff, and when the first meeting, they said, "Does anybody want to be the photo editor?" Well, I like to be a boss, so I was like, I'll be the photo editor. And a couple of other students said, "Well, you're just joining the paper. You just can't join and be the photo editor. Like, who are you? What?" And it worked out that I ended up becoming the photo editor. And I thought, well, this is kind of fun. I think I'm going to be a photojournalist. And I had no idea the path that you would need to take to become a photojournalist, but I had decided then and there that that's what I wanted to be. So I reached out to the local newspaper and said, "Hey, I'm a photojournalist here in Greensburg. I want to be on your staff." And the photo editor at that paper said, "You know, that it's not the way it works. You don't just say I want to be a photojournalist. You need to follow all the, you know, this journey, and you need an education in photojournalism or a degree." So I called him every day for months to see if he had any openings, and eventually I think I just wore him out, and he said, "Listen, I'll give you a shot as a stringer photographer, and you know, it's $35 for an assignment. I'll let you shoot a basketball game on your campus." And he said, "Do you have a 70 to 200?" And I had no idea what that was, so I wrote it down. I said, "Yeah, sure, I have that." And he says, "What do you shoot, Canon or Nikon?" So I thought, Canon, wrote that down. He asked me about a flash, and I said, "Sure, I have a 540 EZ flash." I wrote that down. I got in my car. I drove to a camera shop in Pittsburgh. I walked in with my list and I said, "I need all these things." And I charged it on a credit card, drove back to the game, and I walked in and I had no idea how to even load the film in the camera. So I went up to another photographer at the game and I said, "Hey, I need to load this film in this camera. Can you help me?" So he loaded it in and then he told me, "Push it." And I thought that meant like, you know, push it. Yeah, I'll push it. I'll push it. But that's a photography term to like expose your film in a way that can shoot in darker environments. So he showed me how to do that and shot the game and went back to the newspaper, and the photo editor liked one of the photos and said, "Hey, you're not half bad." And I started stringing for them. And that's kind of how I started.
So as a photo editor, take a step back, a photo editor for your school paper, that's like people bring you photos and you kind of check out and say, okay, this is the one that we're going to put in or not. Like you're not necessarily editing the photo. You're just making sure that which one's going to get published.
Yeah, making choices about what should run. And I had no idea what I was doing at the school newspaper in the beginning. And likewise, I had no idea what I was doing when I started stringing for the Greensburg newspaper. But I was determined that I was not going to stop. So I went out every day and practiced photos and practiced how to do different exposures and different f-stops and all this stuff. And would chase the scanner, you know, like a police scanner. And I would try to beat the staff photographers to news events. And eventually I was doing it with some success and you know, making $35 an assignment. And it led into a part-time job at a newspaper in Trenton, Pennsylvania, which was an iconic newspaper that, you know, Eddie Adams, the famed photographer from the Vietnam War era, worked there in New Kensington and is from New Kensington. John Philo, the photographer from the Kent State photo, was an intern there. So this paper has a long history of photojournalism, and that's kind of where I cut my teeth and just continued to learn as much as I could learn. And it eventually led me to my position in Pittsburgh at the Pittsburgh newspaper, the Tribune Review.
That's a pretty good ladder to climb there from paper to paper up to the Trib, which I would think, and you guys are both from Pitt Greensburg. So does Pittsburgh's paper kind of hold like a plateau in that area of like, okay, that's a little more big time because it's the nearest city?
Yeah,
maybe not.
It was, I mean, my path. I don't think my path exists today. I don't think that a young photographer wanting to be a photojournalist could take the path that I took. And, you know, it was a matter of luck and timing and perseverance, really. And, you know, Pittsburgh was a big newspaper, and there was 2 newspapers in Pittsburgh at the time. The Pittsburgh Tribune Review doesn't exist the way it did when I was there. And they surely don't have international scope like they did when I was there. But when I joined the paper staff, they said, you know, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to cover international news." And the publisher at the time was, you know, into covering those types of stories and helped promote it and gave me that ability.
When you say, where did the passion come from to cover international stories?
Well, I think it's a curiosity that's been in me since I was a kid. You know, I never had a camera, but I always had like a point and shoot camera, and I was interested in looking at things, and I was interested in learning about things, and I loved history. So about the time that I went to the Valley News Dispatch in Trenton, was right about the time of 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, these international stories kind of moved to the forefront of what I was seeing and hearing about. My colleagues that I had become friends with were going and covering the wars. I always wanted to be tested. I wanted to do whatever I was doing to the fullest that I could do it. And it seemed to me that like conflict photography was something that involved, risk and great reward. And I wanted to, I set my goals on that and I wanted to achieve it. One of my close friends was a photographer named Chris Hondros, and Chris was with me on 9/11, and we were in Shanksville when soon after the plane crashed there. And we, had worked that scene for a while and tried to cover it as well as we could. And Chris said to me, hey, I'm leaving. Do you want to come with me? And he got in his car and drove to New York. And from New York, he ended up in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, he ended up in Tora Bora. And I chose to stay back and not take that path. But Chris went on to cover the conflicts in really every conflict in the last 20 years, and eventually was killed in Libya doing that kind of work. But my path then was a little slower. I stayed at the newspaper and felt that I had to cover kind of the stuff that was happening here, and that eventually I would be able to go over there and tell those stories.
I look back on my own career. I haven't covered anything quite as monumental and history making as September 11th, but like I hear from a lot of people in the field who have, when you're in a situation like that, and you were fairly early in your career, when you're in a situation like that, did the gravity of it and of what you were trying to capture kind of hit you? Or is that something that like after the fact, when you're going back and looking at your images? Because I always wonder about people like yourself who are in these situations where these major things are happening and they're trying to capture it, as it's unfolding through a lens. Do you kind of understand the gravity of what's happening around you as you're doing it? Or is it something when you get back and you look at your film or your images, you're like, whoa, what did I just see?
It varies. Sometimes you do recognize the situation you're in. In 9/11, I don't think I did. I was young. I don't think any of us really knew like what that day was in the moment, particularly because this was, I know I had a cell phone, but I don't believe it was like a smartphone. I wasn't really, I could make calls and little things like that. So I wasn't really sure what was happening. Once I got in my car and drove to Shanksville, I was kind of off the radar, and most of us were. I remember standing kind of on this side of the road where they kind of had media kind of crowd, and we had no idea that what was happening in New York, but we knew that there were no planes flying, and all of a sudden a plane flew overhead, and we all just stopped and froze and watched this plane. And I photographed it, and the photo's seemingly a boring photo of a plane flying overhead. But I think about what that meant to us at the time. We were all kind of, wow, what is this plane? And it happened to be Governor Tom Ridge flying out to the site. But, it wasn't until that day I finished shooting and was driving home to process my film that I had a chance to even catch up on what actually happened that day. Wow. And then the way our work goes, you're into the next day already. I was into blood drives and all the stuff that kind of followed. And I continued to go to Shanksville very, very frequently for years and visit the site and try to kind of figure out what that site meant to me, to the people, to the community, to the country. And, actually I had shot film then, and I turned in a few pictures for the newspaper, but it wasn't until this year I actually sat down and looked through my entire take. And there was, a handful of pictures that at the time probably wouldn't have been powerful images that would have ran in the newspaper. But now, with 20 years between us, the photos had a different kind of weight. And I kind of looked at them, and they told a story that I don't think I would have seen then. So I didn't realize the value that I had, but it took 20 years for that value to really be seen for me. And it was kind of an interesting thing to sit down on the 20th anniversary. And I decided not to go to the site, but instead look through my old pictures and see what I could say with them.
Would you say that's something that you truly love about photography, is that the image speaks differently over time?
Yeah, I think that has, for me with my work, I feel like I work kind of in the quiet moments, that sometimes they may not have the immediacy that loud big photos might have, but they have, I hope, a longer lifespan when you can kind of look back and realize that it says something greater than you originally anticipated.
How did you find that? It was one of like the main questions I had for you. Was every writer, every storyteller sort of finds their thing. Like what kind of really pulls them in and says, this is what why I love the art. Like I have a background in acting. A lot of our audience knows that. The thing that, you know, I loved diving into a complex character and trying to like piece together what that life is and then trying to portray that. You know, and I just, that idea of the quiet moment really rings true with me, because you find that in acting as well. You find this weird sort of thing on stage or in front of the camera where it's human, it's very real. But I mean, I don't know if you started off thinking, I want to find the quiet moments, you know, in a basketball game. But yeah, how did you find it?
No, I think I was always driven to the really loud moments. And one of the reasons I selected some of the photos that I selected today was, you know, another photographer that I work with, a colleague of mine, had said that even in the quiet moments, I sought out conflict. Mm-hmm. And I was, you know, even things that may seem simple or mundane there was a lot happening in them, and there was power in it. And I think it was just a matter of, you know, it's not how I started out, but I think that your style kind of finds you. And I don't know if there's a good answer to why I kind of find those moments more fascinating for me, but it's just kind of where my lens goes. I kind of move into the quiet. And also because, you know, a lot of times when you're working on big stories or whatever, there's a whole bunch of photographers and journalists working together. Mm-hmm. And I always hated the idea of like providing a viewer or a reader the same thing the guy next to me was providing. Mm-hmm. So in those big scrums of journalists, I would always kind of like sneak off to the side and go, what, everybody's looking here, but what's happening here? Mm-hmm. And, you know, that also took a little bit of, I was fortunate that the newspaper that I worked for allowed me that ability, that not necessarily to always come back with a picture that is the picture, but something off to the side that would say something. That having that freedom is the way you're able to do those types of things. In today's day and age, the way newspapers work, it's all about like the immediacy of like, you better be Snapchatting and FaceTiming and you got to shoot this, and you got to have this, and you got to send it all in, and it's got to be posted before you come back and file your photos. And you can't work to find those quiet moments because you're so rushed to tell all these stories immediately.
So you're working at the, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I see newspaper that, you know, that's a failure that's happening now with media.
So you're working at the Trib. What was your next step? How long were you there? I started at the Pittsburgh Trib right around 2002 or 3, and I stayed there until I guess about 5 years ago. I'm really bad with time. It was time to go. There was a lot of changes happening in the newspaper. The editor was more or less forced to retire, and he was like a father to me. And I knew what I had said to myself: when he was gone, I was gone. Yeah. And the day he walked out of the newspaper, I turned in my notice and took a buyout and went freelance. And I knew that probably meant the end of my international coverage, because it's a hard story to tell financially, and a way to get to these places to tell these stories. And I thought, well, and this was, you know, a time when a lot was happening in America, and that's when I kind of decided that it was important that I seek out the kind of stories I sought out internationally here, and to tell those stories. And quite honestly, you know, I lost my friend Chris in conflict, and
I was getting older, and there's a reason why there's not a lot of like really old conflict photographers. It was time for me to find a new path, and that was my freelance career, which has been incredibly rewarding. And honestly, now if you ask me, I wouldn't go back to newspapers. I would stay on this path. Because it's allowed me so many different varieties of things. Where I'm making films. I still do. My passion has always been photojournalism, but I do commercial photography and all, you name it. If you can do it with a camera, I do it. And all of those things kind of give me different rewards. But I'll always stay true to my photojournalism. That's who I identify as.
Justin, I want to ask you about being in conflict. I guess like a two-part question. Talk to us about how maybe like the first time you found yourself in one of those places, and also how you maintain a sense of like being able to do what you're there to do, which is capture these moments in such turmoil, but also like do your job. Because I have a friend that I've come to know through the series I do, who was a combat cameraman, so kind of similar, except he worked not with still photography, but with video. And he and I talked a lot about like how difficult it was kind of in some of those moments to, realize that, hey, you still have a job to do, even though there's like chaos going on around you. So I guess talk to us a little bit about maybe like how you kind of found yourself in a conflict zone the first time, and what that's like to kind of have to go through those moments and still, shoot photos, which is what you're there to do.
Yeah. Well, I started out kind of knowing that I wanted that path to be able to cover conflict, that I had to start somewhere. So what I did is, in my head, I devised this plan that I had to plan it. I couldn't just jump into war zones. I had to kind of figure out a path to train myself in some way. So I did a trip to Cuba, and then from Cuba, I went to India and worked on a project, kind of trying to figure out how do you immerse yourself in these places where you don't speak the language. You have all these obstacles you have to kind of overcome. How do you hire a fixer, a driver? How do you get to here and there?
The fixer is the person that sort of sets you up with the people you want to shoot with? Or
yeah, fixer, it fixes everything. If you need whatever you need in country, that's a person that helps you get it, sets up interviews, figures out travel and safety, security, and all those things. And
like I'm my child's fixer.
Yeah,
like I get her everything.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
And from there, then I went to Pakistan, and I went to Pakistan after Benazir Bhutto was assassinated, maybe a couple weeks after that happened. And I ended up spending several months in Pakistan. It might have been 2 or 3 months. And
this was on your own?
No, this was for the newspaper with a reporter.
Wow. Okay.
The reporter I worked with, her name was Betsy Heil, and she lived in Egypt. She was a tremendous conflict reporter to work with. And she and I would sit down together and say, we need to go somewhere. What do we want to do? And we would come up with these stories. And we decided we wanted to go to Pakistan and see what was happening there. Because again, all the focus at that time was kind of on Iraq. And this was 2008. And Afghanistan was barely being covered at that point. And, nobody was talking about Pakistan. So we said, let's go see what it looks like in Pakistan right now. And we did, I think, some terrific reporting from there, and traveled all over the region. I stayed with the former president and saw kind of what was happening on his end and elections that were happening. We were tracking potential top Taliban fighters that were hiding in Pakistan, and interviewing people that could tell us about why that was happening and how that was happening. And we worked kind of along the Pakistan border with Afghanistan, and we did that for several months.
I mean, that's a very, as they would say in the military, very kinetic spot. You're dealing with Taliban coming across the border, forward and back, and American military had a lot of FOBs all up and down that border, correct?
Yeah, it was dangerous. It was dangerous work, and there was so many different threats in Pakistan. We had a suicide bomber, bomb an area near where we were having dinner, and there was kidnapping threats against us and potential threats to kill us. There was, in the end, it ended up our visas had expired, and we had to be, I don't want to say evacuated, but we had to leave the country immediately.
Mhm.
And we left Pakistan, and that's a long story that would take us probably 5 years of your podcast to tell it all. But
We got a lot of episodes, so yeah, you want to come
we
back on to have that conversation. I'd love to hear more about it.
yeah we fled Pakistan and made it to Dubai, and I personally told myself I will never go back there again. The risks were just it was a lot. It was more than I had anticipated, and we came back and regrouped, and the next year I went back to Pakistan, 2009.
Now, did you have a family also at this point? Like,
I
did you
did.
have
Yeah.
Does that shift your thinking of this? Like how having like a child and being like, I can still put myself into a hot spot. Like, what was that process thinking through? I certainly wouldn't think less of you for you need to do your job. You need to tell these stories. But was there a bit of you that was like, I'm putting my life on the line. Also, there's these other responsibilities.
Yeah, I had a conversation with myself that I want my child and now my children to know that their dad believed in something, and he believed that sometimes if you do the right thing, it involves great risk. And with great risks also comes great reward. And I really, truly believe that with my camera, I was able to make a difference in the world. And it may not be a huge difference. I may not change policy. I may not change the direction of wars or things, but I might change a few people's minds. Mm-hmm. And I believe that if you can do that, then you've had some success. I would want them to do the same thing. So whatever they were passionate about, even if it involved great risk, that they would do it and believe in it. And I had that conversation with myself when I became a father, that's something I want them to understand and do themselves.
I had heard you speak of that. Go ahead.
I realized I didn't answer your question about when I was first in combat and how do you work when you're in these situations. And my whole point about Pakistan was, so from Pakistan, I was on this side of the border. I left Pakistan and went to Afghanistan and came in from the opposite side of the border. And that was my first endeavor into actual conflict photography. Being an embedded journalist, I was embedded with the 101st Airborne. And when I remember when I first made it into Afghanistan, I flew into Kabul airport and took a taxi from there to Bagram Air Force Base. And at Bagram, you go in and they kind of figure out where they're going to send you. And I kind of just showed up at the gate. I'm like, hey, I'm here for my embed. And they kind of direct us to where we had to go.
Did you have orders to be embedded, or you just showed up? Okay.
Yeah, that was
very much just like calling the editor at the very beginning of your career and being like, hey, I'm here.
Hey. No, it was all set up ahead in advance. And I knew it was expected that day, and just showed up at the gate. They left you in, and I joined the rest of the journalists who were there trying to figure out where they were all going. And I didn't really have any, they would ask, where do you want to do? What do you want to see? And my main thing was I had been on this border with Pakistan. I kind of wanted to see what was happening on the Afghan side of the border. Mm-hmm. So they put us on a plane to another base called Salerno. And I remember taking off on the C-130 with all the soldiers who were kind of going into combat. And I had my earbuds in and was listening to music that to me was, I listened to Paint It Black. And there was an old TV show when I was growing up and called Tour of Duty. And that was like the theme song, I believe, for that show. And to me, for some reason, that's the song that was in my ears when I took off and was like entering war zone. So now I can't hear that song without thinking about that flight, kind of taking off through the mountains of Kabul. But the first time I was in combat, like the first firefight was, I tell people it was a lot like, to me, it wasn't a big deal. It was like, this is what I'm here for. This is what I do. And I think about my father, who's been a volunteer fireman for decades. And I tell him, I'm like, it's no different than what you do. You rush into a burning building when everybody's rushing out, and it's what you do. You don't think twice about it. So when I was there and we were ambushed, it was time to work. And my focus became make pictures and figure out how do you do this and tell this story safely. And it all turns off and all turns on at the same time. Like your senses are heightened. I could still see the tracer fire kind of flying around me, but I was so keyed into like what I was doing that I felt like, I was just in the zone and able to focus on, at that time I was looking at where is there light that I can make a picture, because it's pitch black. And I'm looking for little tiny bits of light that I was able to use to make pictures, because I couldn't obviously have a flash on. And, cameras weren't as sophisticated then as they are now to be able to shoot in low light environments.
Right.
What kind of is that relationship like between you and, the people that you're embedded with? Because like you're all, they have their military culture and their lifestyle, and then you're coming in and looking at things from a different perspective. So what's that, dynamic kind of like being embedded with these people and having to kind of essentially, it's like a weird version of a job shadow, like you're following them around to where they go.
Yeah, it takes a little while to have them loosen up to you. And we were fortunate in Afghanistan that I spent most of my time with one group of soldiers. So I had time to get to know them. And I used to, at the time I was a smoker, so I would sit out in the smoking hut with them and just kind of listen to them and figure out how I could get them comfortable with me being there at a camera. And eventually, I told them, I'm like, I'm not here to play gotcha. I'm here to tell your stories. And if I'm not here to tell it, then maybe no one will. Who knows? I mean, it's a big country. It's a lot of soldiers and not a lot of journalists. And I think your story is important. And, I think they recognized that they had something, this group that I was with was kind of a mixture of, these kids were mechanics and a whole bunch of different jobs that were thrust into like combat infantry troops. And they didn't necessarily know what they were doing. And they were 25 kids who were patrolling 500 square miles of Afghanistan. That was their area of operation.
Significant, like that you can't cover that much ground with that. And I totally agree with your term kids. Like they're kids out in this, fob trying to protect this area from God knows what, and the people they're fighting know the terrain.
Yeah. Yeah. And, they, in the beginning, I was there kind of in the beginning of their embed. And I think they were, they had trained for this. They were having some fun. Right. And then war shows up and the reality of war happens. And, I think that if I were to sit down with them at the end of their embed compared to the beginning when I was there, they would have very different opinions of what they experienced. I know they lost some soldiers, and some of the soldiers that I was with were killed soon after I left. And, the human mind is a powerful thing that's able to kind of disconnect in times. And even in these really scary moments, you find, levity and humor, and you do things to kind of protect yourself from what you're really in. I mean, we all do it. And it's not a matter of being insensitive towards the situation. It's a matter of like just human condition and doing it. It's one of the things I look at in my photography is that to me, it's also about in these war zones, that it's also about the people who live there, and this is their home. So they see war completely different than we do, who are just kind of show up and like, oh, this is dangerous and this is this. Well, they've lived with it. And a lot of times in Afghanistan, they had lived with war their entire lives. Mm-hmm. And they have seen this for a long time, and they're conditioned to, the kids look no different than the kids we have in our streets here in Pittsburgh, and they want to play soccer and they want to chase after trucks and throw sticks and stones. And but you're sitting there going like, literally there's bombs going off around these kids, and there's, every day they're seeing, heavy military equipment driving through their streets, but yet they're playing stickball and playing cricket in the streets as though life is normal. So these soldiers were kind of grappling with that, like what is what is normal to them.
I'm glad you brought up the term, just the reality of war. And before we get to your pictures, I want to ask you one more question, because you've mentioned your friend Chris, who you lost in Libya, and this idea of reality of war. Like, you don't really know what a soldier's been through with losing someone until you've lost someone in a war zone as well. How did Chris's death sort of change you and change your process in your photojournalism career and your thoughts on it?
Well, it made me really question, in the beginning, it made me question, is it worth it? Was it worth it for Chris to be there? He had accomplished so much in his life that, when is enough? When do you know to say, I'm done. I've done what I need to do and step back. And I think Chris was at that point, which is the real tragedy. And he was at the point where he was kind of done with conflict. And this was maybe one of his last trips. And the day that he was killed he went out that morning and shot some just tremendous images, and could have been done at that. Went back to the hotel and filed his stuff, but he went back out again, and that's when he was killed alongside of Tim Hetherington. And I wonder about conversations that I would have with Chris now, and say to him, like, well, what would you have done? What do you recommend? What should I be doing this stuff? Are you glad you did it? And I could hear him saying, like, no, it's not worth it. Like, live to tell another story, another day. And there's others, war isn't the only story out there. I mean, especially when you think of war and the fallout of war, and you think about all the veterans that come home and what they're faced with. And those stories are important to tell too. And those stories can actually help a lot of other veterans to understand, like, I'm going through that same thing. And they see it in this story of this other person, and maybe that helps them get help in a way, or helps them find a career path or something to find some reward, or even a group to hang out with that can share similar interests and tell war stories. Because it's not that people don't want to talk about their experiences in war all the time. Sometimes it's hard to relate to a person who's been in these situations, that they can't just talk to a civilian who doesn't understand it. Because when I say these guys were having fun, someone might hear that and take offense to that, but another veteran would understand, like, we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun, and it's a hard thing for people to wrap their mind around. So people are very cautious about how they tell their stories about a time in war, because unless you were there to experience it, you may take it the wrong way.
I've heard it described as long stretches of boredom mixed with flashes of terror. And like, in those moments of boredom, you probably are having fun, playing cards, messing with each other, things like that. But that sort of rings true, and it was very well said. Catherine.
Yeah, Justin, you talk about, like, you said something that kind of, I know we've talked about here at the VBC, and I've talked about with a lot of veterans, is like being a soldier and being in combat and military service, while a large part of people's lives, and I don't mean to diminish with their service at all by saying this, it's not for a lot of people, it's not their entire life. Like, they're still, parents and brothers and sisters, and, they are children themselves, and they have other interests in other things. And I think what got me about one of the photographs that you sent us was, I'm sure we'll talk about it when Sean pulls them up, but like, a lot of these photographs, you show kind of like the reality of what happens back home. Like, we think of the realities that they go through during war and during conflict, but sometimes maybe more touching and heartbreaking is the reality of what they have to come back home to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the people, war leaves giant holes, not just in, the loss of a soldier, but that ripple effects of who that loss affects. I just came back. I just was in Texas this past week covering a marathon where this group called Wear Blue runs for Gold Star families. They run the marathon, and they have posters up of all the soldiers who had lost their lives, and soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, service members that lost their lives. And, they gather around in a circle before they run, and they tell who they're running for. And I stood down there. I've never been with this group before. And imagine they're running for maybe 100 different service members. And I'm sitting there, and they go around the circle. And 3 of the service members they mentioned, I either knew a relative of or covered a story about. And you listen to, you see that generations are affected by these losses, and that their kids who have lost a father that had never met them, we're talking about that, and the struggles that they have, that it's a lot bigger than just the war.
While a lot of times when we talk about veterans and their service, we focus on their points of their points when they're in combat or in conflict, but like there is a whole ripple effect of what happens when people come home. And that's also why I loved a few of the photos that you sent us that we'll talk about. Is it you really kind of showed all aspects of what that life is and what that means. And I think that's something that we talk about that, Sean, all the time here at the BBC. Like, it's important to remember what happens when our military comes home too.
Yeah, it's the battlefield stretches far beyond these foreign soils. It stretches home, and these soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, they are faced with this story goes on, and it affects in many different ways, and down to the spouses and the children, and coming home and trying to find your place in society, because you were if you were out there on the front lines, you were trained to do things that you don't do in normal life. So how do you come back and kind of reassimilate to society in a way that allows you those same feelings that maybe you enjoyed, is the rush, the adrenaline? It's the same thing for combat photographers. I don't talk about it much, but I was diagnosed with PTSD, and part of the reason for my PTSD diagnosis was that I was running on this heightened level of adrenaline in my work, that I was always kind of like, in danger and in risks and having all these things happen around me. And then I would come back to my normal daily assignments and be covering, a marbles tournament or, a bake sale. And in my, it was hard for me to like make that adjustment to life. And I would come home, it may not have been, again, the big loud moments and the bombs and the guns and that kind of thing, but it was just living in this always kind of peril and then not.
Yeah.
And how do you kind of find that balance again?
Mm-hmm. Well, for our audience, we're going to get over to the pictures now. So if you've been listening to audio, now's the time to jump over to YouTube. Don't know if we'll be able to have time to get through all of the pictures that Justin has so graciously supplied us with. But Justin, I'm gonna give you the crack on which one you would like to bring up. Is there a particular one that you would like to talk about?
I think the Pinky Kisses one is one that resonates with a lot of people. This is an image on the border. I traveled the entire border with Mexico from Brownsville, Texas to San Diego. And this is where the border wall ends and spills into the Pacific Ocean in San Diego. And this is a young child meeting his grandmother for the first time. And this is the extent of the physical contact that they have ever had, and that they have, is just they are able to touch what they call pinky kisses through the border fence.
Wow.
Yeah,
Just one of those ones, I can only imagine how many hundreds or thousands of photos you take while you're out, at a place on assignment, or, when you go with your freelance work. But, is this one of those images where like you realized what you captured in the moment, or were you kind of back looking through all your photos and then you realize, this is the one? Because I know, from my own experience, journalists take a lot of photos or a lot of video, and sometimes you don't always realize what you have until you get a second look at it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole story about how I even had to get this picture, which was crazy. But I realized it was a moment that was really important. But I had worked for 3 months traveling the border and had all these photos from the 2,000 miles of border. But it's what always kind of strikes me is that this is the photo I always show when I talk about the border, and all those other photos, all that other work for 3 months kind of boils down to this. And I feel like when people ask me, what does the border crisis mean to me? As journalists, we kind of stay impartial and out of the story, but this is real. This is the reality of the border fence, is that it separates these families and they're unable to have, you know, the things that humans should be allowed to have: physical contact, to hug your grandmother, to meet your grandmother face to face. And that, you know, what is the right answer? I don't know, but surely it's not that. Kids shouldn't have to just touch pinkies with their grandmother. So I want to strike that conversation up and hope that that affects someone and maybe changes their opinion in some way, to understand that these are human beings, and that, you know, I'm not saying one answer is right or wrong, but this, as humans, this is not the way we should, you know, want our society to be.
And
So
that, like, you just, oh, I'm sorry, but I was, before this, you just struck a chord with me as a fellow, you know, journalist, in a sense, because you said as journalists, we're supposed to remain impartial. And, you know, people see the images that we will put on paper or out there, or the stories that we cover. And, you know, sometimes when you get in these large situations like you at the border, it's almost like how your being a human being overtakes being a journalist. Like, how do you not feel something about what you're covering? And I think, especially probably for you in still photography, that makes a better, you know, a better image, you putting your own feeling behind it and capturing and understanding, and, you know, having an opinion about how others are feeling. Like, as a journalist, it's almost impossible, especially with the major things happening in the world right now, to stay impartial anymore.
it is hard. And you know, I take great pride in my work, that in my entire career, I feel like it would be very hard to say that I have a side. I feel like you can look through my body of work and see that I've given everybody a voice, even people that, you know, fundamentally I probably disagree with at a personal level, but at a professional level, as a journalist, I still give them a voice and a platform to tell their story, as long as I feel their story is not you know, completely off base or steeped in some you know, false narrative. But
Yeah.
I go into this, it's hard to not, you know, have a side. But my side, really, the side I think all journalists should have, is truth. And my pictures, I try to seek out the truth, and I don't have to add my opinion into something. I can simply show you this and say, like, this is the reality of it. This is what I saw. And I traveled the whole border, and I saw all kind of other things. I was in stash houses, and I was with coyotes who were smuggling people across the border. And I was, you know, in tunnels where they were tunneled under the wall. And I saw all of that. And through all of that, through 3 months of the travel and the miles, it boiled down to this to me. And this is what I saw that really affected me. And it's like, we all are humans. And if we don't feel things when we see an image like this, then I really feel sorry for us as a society.
Certainly this one was very striking to me. And I wonder, my thought goes to, how did they leave this fence? Like, the moment they both decided to turn around and walk back to their side, and what was this little boy's experience for that, you know, how does he feel after that? That's, I don't know, that's where my thought process kind of goes. And the loss that I'm sure the grandmother feels, of like, you know, that's as close as I'm going to get. And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And the sad part is, you know, this is a story that's repeated all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
That a lot of these wars we cover are based on a line drawn in the sand that says this is this country and that's that country. And if you go to these places, and, you know, places in Pakistan where I was along the border, and, you know, I saw it in Ukraine, I saw it in Egypt, and all these other countries. This line, this arbitrary line that says this is this country and this is this country. And if you cross this line, we're going to fight you. But you go there, and you know, I was on the border in the U.S. border with Mexico, and there's a Native American woman who lives on the last house on the last road between the U.S. and Mexico, but her yard is now split in half. Half of her relatives are on one side, and the other half are on the other side. And for her to visit people in her backyard, she has to drive all the way out 2 hours to a checkpoint to go through a border cross station and all the way back to her other backyard. And for her, you know, she didn't identify as this or that. She was Tohono O'odham, and this was her tribal lands, and this is where she grew up, and her family's on this side of that line that someone drew, and this on the other side of the rest of them. But the idea of borders is something that wars have been fought over for forever and will continue to be fought over, but it should strike the conversation of like, what is this land we're fighting over, and is there a better way to do it? I don't know. I don't have those answers, but simply try to tell the stories to let other people come to those conclusions.
Is there another image that you would like to highlight?
Oh, I don't even remember what I sent you. So
let's go with, I'm going to go with the soldier kissing his newborn, which I don't, maybe Catherine, was this the one that?
Oh, this is the one that got me.
Yeah, it's me too. I both of us, all three of us sort of having young children. Whenever I was researching Justin and his photos, this one popped up, and it, like, you don't know this feeling until you're there with your newborn, but certainly we all don't know this feeling of being a soldier who then has to leave their newborn, which to me is just, I can't process that. But boy, how did you find yourself in this moment, Justin?
This was a group of soldiers in New Kensington who were deploying, I want to say, to Kosovo. This is probably in early 2000. Yeah, I think it might have been 2000. And it was at one of the, you go to the event at the armory, and families are all there waving the flags, and everybody's getting ready to head out and leave and go to war or go deploy. And this was, again, one of those moments where all the media was kind of over here. And I walked back into a room where this is the room where like the soda machines were. And I saw him kind of walk back there with his baby by himself and with his wife, I believe. And I just followed along thinking, well, there's something's going to happen. And this intimate, quiet moment happened. And I was just there and captured it and kind of went back. And this is another instance where I didn't really know if I got it or not, because the light was kind of weird. And it was this dark room with fluorescent lights and soda machines everywhere. Which is why it's in black and white, because in color it just is ugly.
It's amazing to think that.
Black and white.
Yeah, it's just it's a quiet moment that literally would have went unnoticed, except for just a little bit of luck and being in the right spot at the right time. And I have looked at this picture for 20 years and regretted that I did not follow up with this family, because I'd love to find them and see what's happened in their lives. And every time I see it, I think about, I got to reach out and find them. And I've been doing that for 20 years, but it's a quiet moment, in the other room, they're waving flags and there's big banners and God Bless America is playing and all the families are there and all the other media is there. But in this little tiny room, this happens. And this is, to me, says everything that you need to know about being deployed.
To me, I looked at, I'm like getting all emotional again, because your work is so powerful, but like, to me, this perfectly captures the essence of sacrifice, because that little baby is not going to remember that dad, wasn't there for the first couple months, because, we don't remember things when we're, a few weeks old, a few months old, but like, dad is going to remember that forever. And dad did that so that, essentially we can all sit here and be talking about this podcast right now. And I think that is something just really important that I always stress to people to remember, is that it's not, and we talk about this too, it's not just like the combat and the fighting. It's like the self-sacrifice of family time and, stuff that like we as people here, and, you did it too, Justin. I mean, you left your family for periods of time. Like, it's just, it's a lot of sacrifice. And I think you perfectly captured that in a photo. Yeah. And I'm sorry, you just, this one, just, you really got me with this one, man.
Well, you're right. There is, when you think about our service members, not all of them are even, or would be out fighting on the front lines. There's so many support, that they're mechanics, they're engineers, they're, kitchen staff, there's, aviation people that never step out of the wire of the combat outpost or the fob, but are completely, instrumental in everything that happens on a day-to-day basis in war zones. And those people all left their lives behind, and moments like this behind. And when I think about it, it's like you said, the baby may not remember any of this, but how much I miss with watching my son now, my baby develop in a week. And to think that life is so short. We got one run on this ball here, and you can't ever get that time back. It's gone forever. So he missed really some beautiful parts of this child's life that he sacrificed, missing that for the rest of us, so that we didn't have to go do it. And I was fortunate. Yes, I've been there, but also I get to come back. Like, I can leave when I want to leave. I can, I know that I'm not doing a year there. And it's a remarkable commitment.
Yeah, certainly. I agree with Catherine. I agree with both of you, what you both so perfectly put towards this. I can't really add anything more intelligent than that. I love this photo. And I would like to pop up another one here. This one goes to, I'm not sure where you took this photo. Here we are. This is I believe, an Afghan soldier.
Yeah, this is an Afghan soldier. It was on a mission. We were very high up. I think we were at like 10,000 feet elevation, very close to the border with Pakistan. And it kind of struck me, it always, I have a photo, I should have included it, from Iraq, of a young soldier. And I look at these, I just see this is like a kid. And the power and the destruction that he's just even holding, that he has this RPG that can decimate, whatever he shoots at. And there's such a vulnerability in him and in his face, that it just struck me.
I definitely see innocence.
Sure.
But I think that's the first thing that sort of pops into my head.
And it's one of those things, I look at some photos like this and I see people in these instances, and I see us, I see, you take us, he could be anybody. He could be an American. It could be the kid next door. And here he is living this life of combat and war. And yeah.
How old do you think he was?
Oh, I would be shocked if he was 18.
Wow.
So, that was the first thing that struck me too, is, you would think that your eyes in the photo would go to what he's holding, but really I was drawn straight to his face. And my first thing was, my gosh, he's a kid.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that drives all these other questions about, like, the poverty in these regions, and what, forces a kid to end up in this, in the military there. It's not like the military here, where you get benefits and you have all these extra things that can help your life by your service. But, there's a lot of things that put him in that spot in that time that we couldn't understand, because it's very different than our past would be in America.
And we're going to share another here.
This is a photo from a Christian colony in Islamabad, Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And this little girl, it's a very, very poor Christian colony. She's getting water from a broken pipe. That's where they get their drinking water. And these tents that they were living in didn't have floors. They didn't even have blankets on the floor. It was really, really, really crude. And they've been living there her entire life, and many people for a long, long time. And they bathe, they wash their clothes, and they get drinking water from like the same puddle of water. It's right in the middle of Islamabad. So when you picture Islamabad, people who maybe don't know much about it, it's not very different than Washington, D.C. It looks very similar. There's buildings everywhere, and it's a very, big city in Pakistan that you can go out to eat at an Italian restaurant, and you can take a taxi and ride a bus and go to the mall and go shopping. And this is right there in the center of it all.
I'm seeing a lot in your photography is the images that you brought to us, is that I get really focused on one particular piece. Like I'm really focused on her face. Like that really draws me in. But then like suddenly my vision expands into what the story is here. And it's just like, I may not even see the milk jug to start. I just suddenly it's like, oh, there's tents, and oh, this seems like it's, a village, or, what's going on with the pipe. And I start to ask questions about what I'm seeing, beyond just like, what is the look on her face making me feel, which to me, it feels like caution, like she's worried about what's behind the bush that she's looking at. Like, it's almost like threat, fight or flight in a way. That's sort of where I go with it
Yeah. They are threatened because they are a religious minority in Pakistan. They are threatened and face persecution, and they have a very difficult existence.
Mm-hmm.
And what strikes me, this is why I like to do this work, though. I like to be places like that and meet people that otherwise nobody would tell their stories. And she would be forgotten to the world, except for a fact that someone pointed a camera at her and said, I'm going to make sure people know your story for the rest of my life. And that's what I do. I carry these stories along with me and share them. And it's my small way of saying she matters. And she mattered to me in that instance when I, 1/500th of a second when I hit that shutter, but she matters to me every single day that I share her story and share her photo with people. And now she's probably 10 years older. I'm hoping she's not in that community, but maybe she is. And I like to think that maybe she knows that there's someone out there in the world that's still thinking about her. And that's why I love to do these stories. And this community welcomed me with open arms. They were trying to, give me drinks and food, but I knew how little they had. That they were combining whatever they had to bring to me, and I was of course refusing, but they brought me like a little juice box and they insisted, but I thought like they are getting their drinking water from a broken pipe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure they went to every tent in that little area. Like, does anybody have something we can give this Westerner? And they kept asking me like, will you make a difference here? Can you help us? Will people in America help? They took me to their church, which was just, it was just like, it wasn't even 4 walls. I don't know. It was just an area that they called a church. They didn't have a roof. And they asked me like, do you think the churches in America can help us? And I'm very careful to not make promises that I can't keep, but I said, I can't promise anything. All I can promise is I'll tell them about you and hope that something happens. But I don't think anything has ever happened or helped them.
But the last couple, go ahead, Sean.
No, go ahead. Mine's sort of a final thought.
With the last couple of photos that we saw, it brought Sean and I to a place of like, we had a lot of questions. Like we both saw the face at first, and then we had a lot of questions about what's going on here. Why are they in this scenario? As a photojournalist, do you like that your work, provokes that kind of thought in people? Like, is that also something you set out to do, or you hope like when somebody sees your photo, it has them like asking questions about a larger scope of like why things are the way they are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just like I have a photo of a girl in India, and I was doing a story there on what they had hoped would be the end of polio. And she has polio and she lives on the streets and she sells newspapers for like a penny a day. And I had driven by her and I saw her and thought, I have to find this girl and photograph her again. And through an interesting story, I actually did find her again. And her name was Ekta. And she didn't know how old she was, but her parents sent her to live on her own when she was 4 or 5, because they said you would have a better life on your own than you will with us. So to think that they thought she would have a better life if she lived on the streets as a 4 or 5-year-old girl than they would with her, it was because she had polio and she was worthless in their eyes. And, I stopped to photograph her, and it's as I said of the young girl with the broken pipe, like, I have told Ekta's story since the day I took that picture. And I what I feel is to me more important than any award or acclaim or, I don't do what I do for any of that. I do it so that I can tell people stories like Ekta and the little girl with the pipe, and their stories that if for not the past, that a lens was aimed at them, and I was graciously given the honor of being present in their life for a split second, that I have to carry the weight of their story forever, and I have to share it with as many people as I can, to not, maybe influence change or make big things happen, but to make people realize this person matters. And I think that if we do our jobs right as photojournalists, is we're letting people see that these people matter, that cross before our lens, and why they matter. And that, I'm not asking people to go give money and build a church in Pakistan, but I'm asking you to maybe care differently about your neighbor or someone across the globe. When you hear a story on the news comes on, there's been a bombing in, wherever today, we are so conditioned to not care. We're so conditioned to go, oh, another bombing. But what does that look like there? I mean, mothers were lost, fathers were lost, children were lost, generations were changed. And we can't become callous to that every time we hear it, we have to realize the what has happened there and how it has affected the community. That's what I hope with my cameras. I hope that we can go do these things and make people care in some small way and pay attention to what you're hearing on the news. And these are human lives. These are human stories, and we are all tied to the same stories. They're all part of us. We're all one. I know it sounds cliche, but we really are. And the sooner our world realizes that, the better we'll be. But I don't have a lot of hope that we can figure that out, because there's enough people that don't listen to get it.
I can't really think of a better thought to end this program on, though my thought before was that's very much what you just spoke of, was the blessing and the curse of being a photojournalist, that you get to view these moments, and they may be moments of tragedy and heartbreak and loss, but the blessing is that more people, this may change some minds, this may bring attention to something that we don't know about, this, but to be there in person for it has got to be incredibly challenging. And as you continue through your photojournalism career, and as you've changed your focus back to the United States and the myriad of conflicts we have here, just, in our own neighborhoods, I want you to speak a bit about American Reportage and how that is trying to sort of shed light here and what the mission is.
Our mission is, it's a collective of photographers from across the country. There's, a dozen or so of us, and our idea is we're kind of turning our lens inward, and that our focus is telling the story of America's forgotten and underreported on communities and people. And the beauty of it is, because we're kind of all over America in different cities, that we embed in these places where a lot of times the newspapers have disappeared and there's no one to tell the stories. Mm-hmm. But we live in these communities and towns, so we can be here and tell the stories of our neighbors, and we can do it for long periods of time. So we really kind of focus on long form narrative storytelling of big stories. Right now, our collective as a whole is working on a story about water across America and how it affects all these different communities and how it affects us differently. It's there like, as you said, Sean, there's no shortage of stories that are happening right now in our backyards, and it's very important that we tell. There's the last election, the last presidential election was a very divisive election for America, but we can't tell it from one side or another. We have to understand what each side's feelings are, so we know how we got to this point. And you can't do that in a way to like make fun of a side or to exploit a side. You have to kind of come in at it and be willing to listen, because there's no bringing the sides together if one side is making fun of another side or this or this, that. And often the journalists, the problem is we go to these events, when you see a campaign stop, these journalists are flying on a plane, they land on the plane, they're escorted in with the candidate or the president, they sit in the front row. The craziest people that come to these things stand in the front row, They photograph, videotape, film, interview those people, and they walk out thinking, well, that was Pittsburgh, that was Western Pennsylvania. They don't understand what the people that are in the back that are there because they believe in something else. They don't understand what that is. So we have to spend the time in these communities to see what these people are really coming to these conclusions about of their lives, so what they want. And that's kind of where American Reportage steps in. We step in to kind of understand, how did they get here? How do we get here? And how do we fix it? And part of that is listening and understanding that, there's real problems out there in America that aren't being addressed by either side of the aisle. And there's people living in poverty that is, very much like the stuff I've seen in third world countries. I was with a woman in Ohio a couple weeks ago who had no gas in her house since like May. She cooked her food and I had asked, I said, I'm going to come photograph you. Would noon work? And she's like, oh, I need 2 hours to get ready. And I said, 2 hours? What do you need to do? She said, well, it takes me 2 hours to take a bath because I have to fill up my bathtub with teapots that I warm with like a little burner stove.
Oh my God.
And I said, whoa, I need to see that. That's how she's lived since, for months. That shouldn't happen in America. No. That shouldn't happen in a country with as much as we have, with a $700 trillion defense budget. That shouldn't happen here.
Justin, I think your photographs do this, and I like hope to do this in my reporting, is like to open people's eyes to other stuff. Obviously, like in news, we have to do the day-to-day stuff. Like this is a city council meeting and this event, and a lot of it is good stuff. And I'm happy to go, cover ribbon cuttings and all these little things. But like, it's when you find those like gems of like other things that open people's eyes to a bigger issue. It's like, oh, okay, like this is why we do what we do.
I've with my old boss again, this guy, his name was Bill Larkin, and he was a legend. And we used to do a thing at the Valley News Dispatch where we had to go out and shoot golden wed anniversaries. So people who were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary or like 100-year-old birthdays. Mm-hmm. And the
I've seen those. Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah.
We hated it. We hated it. But you know what? One day he pulled me aside. He goes, you know what? This might be the only time that person's picture is in a newspaper. And they're going to cut it out, and they're going to put it on their fridge, and their kids are going to save it, and they're going to keep it forever. So give this person the due time that you're with them, the 5 or 10 minutes, like give them the full bit of you as a person, as a photographer there with the camera, and give them the best picture possible, because it's going to last forever. Mm-hmm. And once he told me that, it hit me that even that ribbon cutting that you're covering, it's really important to that person.
Yep.
And that is part of their story. And it's part of the story of this community. And if there's a ribbon cutting, it means something's opening. And it's a story of this something coming to this town that may be jobs for people. And if it employs 3 people, it's 3 people. And it changes the narrative of this town. So all of those stories are part of the fabric of America and the story that is us. And they're important. And that's one thing, like I go to every assignment as though it's the most important assignment I could ever cover, because it is important to someone, whatever it is. There's no mundane stories, and I try to find the beauty in all of it. And it might not be the story, it might not be the picture, but I might meet someone there that is the most interesting person I could ever meet, and I could enjoy a conversation with them. And that's the beauty of what we do. Is this camera has taken me all over the world, but quite honestly, like, it's not about passport stamps or any of that stuff. To me, it's about the people that I get to meet, and whether it's down the road, an old coal miner, maybe in West Virginia, or, staying with a former president in a foreign country. It's getting the opportunity to be in these people's lives for a minute and meet people that I otherwise would never, ever have the opportunity to meet.
Amen to all that. Hey, Sean, I have to run. I have to do a noon show. But if you want to wrap up the episode now that you're back, not to cut our conversation off, because Justin and I could probably talk about this all day. But
I'm enamored by it, and have a quick story after you jump off. But thank you, Catherine, for being on the Scuttlebutt again. We're looking forward to having you a part of more episodes, and a feature episode that we always do each season. We're looking forward to that later on. But thank you for being a part of it, and we will definitely see you on a future episode.
Yes, I have some good stuff coming up for you, VBC listeners, I promise. And Justin, it was a pleasure to meet a fellow journalist and to have kind of two of the things that I love kind of cross over once again on the Scuttlebutt. Your work is, I'm sure you've heard this a lot, but you're extremely talented and your work is thought-provoking. And I appreciate you sharing all of the photographs and stories with us.
Well, it's all my pleasure, and keep up the good fight out there, and keep telling the stories of your communities, and I really appreciate your time and conversation.
If you ever come to the Ohio Valley, let me know.
I'm there all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, Justin, what we were just saying about capturing a 100-year-old, that might be the first photo that is ever of them in the newspaper. In my previous life as acting, I was able to have a couple pictures in some community papers back in the day, but one picture I want to talk about real quick for our listeners, and something I've not brought up on the podcast, is after 9/11, I was at Point Park University. We went down to the Point to have a vigil. This is the Saturday, I believe the Saturday after, if not a day or two after 9/11. And we were down there holding aluminum things with a candle in it. And I had, during that day prior to the vigil, I was like, feeling very kind of patriotic, trying to absorb what was just happening to our world and our country. And I was like, I'm going to go out into the city and I need to find an American flag. I just need to, I want to buy one. I need one. And found a bandana, grabbed it, and was just like, okay, that's just something that was correlating to how I was feeling. So I purchased it. I took it with me down to the Point. We hold the vigil. We go down to the fountain, a couple of friends and myself. We're sitting in front of the fountain, and I'm still holding this candle. I had the American flag bandana sort of over my shoulder. And we're just sitting there chatting. And eventually someone walks up to me and they're like, hey, I just took your picture for the Post-Gazette. And I was wondering if that's okay that I use it. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. What's your name? Where are you from? And so I told her. And about 3 days later, my mom calls me and she goes, why are you on the front cover of the Post-Gazette? And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, your grandmother called me and said, you're on the front cover of the Post-Gazette. Here's the picture of the presidents at their vigil, all the last three, Clinton, Bush, and Bush Jr. And this enormous picture of me on the front cover of the Saturday edition, holding this candle, and it's just me in front of the fountain. And I still get chills talking about it, because I remember running down to the corner store, buying like 3 copies of this, and then going back to like my dorm room and just sitting there and not really quite sure how to feel about it. And it was like, and it was the reason why I bring it up now is because I feel like it wasn't important that I was on the front cover. It was this idea of mourning and patriotism and what that picture brought out. And I remember sitting in the dorm room thinking, I hope someone sees this picture and feels the same level of mourning and patriotism that I was feeling in that moment. And I feel like she really captured that.
Yeah. You're part of the recorded record. You see your picture in a newspaper, and this is something we're losing as newspapers disappear, is that this tangible thing that I'm part of the historic record of this day for this town. There's power in that. And I think the loss of our small community newspapers is a great loss in America. That's going to change. It's going to change a lot. Our small towns are going to be so affected, and there's just going to be a lot that happens with the demise of small town community newspapers.
I want to finalize this all with one last question for you, because I thought you spoke so much truth in the idea of these community papers, the personal stories that are happening, and these are what really matter, and these are how we're going to find our way back to working together as a country. Is there a place that you go to get your news for that level of truth? Is that something that we can give our audience to say, hey, better than going to the big networks that you might not get these personal stories from, where do you go?
It's tough anymore. I mean, there isn't enough places to get local news. And the problem with that is that when people maybe don't understand it, but in the terms of veterans, we can use, when you think about, I covered a lot of funerals of fallen soldiers. And, in the beginning, I would get some kind of, people would get kind of angry to see me there. And I would always seek out family members, and I would say to them, listen, I know it seems wrong to have a camera here in this moment, or that, I understand how you feel vulnerable and you feel exploited by us being here. I want you to understand that I am here because I care, and because someone cares, and because it's important we tell the story about your lost loved one and their sacrifice. And the day we stop telling those stories is a really sad day for America. And I think we've got to that point actually now where, we don't necessarily see the coverage we did before. And that tells me something about where we stand as a society, and, how kind of callous we've become to the loss and sacrifice of our service members. But when these small papers go away, if it's not a milestone loss, so if it's not the 500th soldier or the 1000th
Or the
soldier,
last, or the, yeah.
or the last, who's telling the story about the ones in between if the local paper isn't there? And there's a lot of places where they're not doing the work they used to do. I don't know where to get the news with some of that stuff. I have that conversation with a lot of people. They're like, well, who do you trust? And I said, you actually have to do a little bit of the legwork yourself. You have to fact check. Disinformation on both sides is a really scary thing that's happening in our country. And you have to make sure, if you're reading the news and you're getting information, that you're fact checking it to see that it is accurate, because there's a lot of small publications that have crept in the vacancy, the hole that's been left by these local papers being gone. There's blogs and other publications coming out that don't follow the same ethics and credibility that a publication should. So you have to find out who you can trust, and in the reporting. It's tough.
I was going to suggest that maybe, and maybe it's more of literally doing the legwork, that the truth is out there if you go to the diner to seek it.
Yeah, a lot for me. I find it on my own, and I use things like Twitter, and I use it in a way that I know that the people I'm following are people that are there on the scene and in the front lines that can tell me what they see, and then I can disseminate what is truth through that. And I know that, having worked for major publications like the New York Times and Washington Post, that the stories are fact checked, and there are with anything with a source, you have 3 sources corroborating a story or an idea. We have to understand that in all these major newspapers, like accredited newspapers, that opinion is on the editorial pages, but what you find in the pages in between the opinion section it should be truth. And that's something that that gray area has been smudged a little bit. I turn on CNN and I see a platform of 5 people that all have different political views sharing their political views. Well, I want the news. I don't want opinion. I want the news, and I want the facts. And by diluting that pool and people hearing those opinions, they don't know what is real and isn't real anymore in society with what they're getting. And it's, our credibility and our ethics are the most important thing we have, and we've damaged them as a whole, a member of the media.
Justin, I want to thank you for spending the time with us on the Scuttlebutt. I feel really great about this episode. There's just a lot of insights that came to light during this, and we went into a lot of different directions, which I wasn't sort of expecting, but I feel like as an audience and myself just listening, there's a lot of education in this episode to dive into. And I would love to, invite you back onto the podcast eventually. There's a lot of stories that I'm sure we didn't get into of just being embedded with the 101st and, your time with the soldiers. I would love to help you through VBC find the soldier that you took the picture of with the baby. I'm sure that there's a way to do that. And I would hope that he's still around. And oddly enough, his baby's now 21 years old and in college. How does that happen? We all get a little grayer just as every day goes by. But this was a really fantastic conversation. I want to thank you just so much for being a part of it and for sharing your images with us. I echo what Catherine said before, just incredible images. And I'm so happy that those stories are being told here and through these and through your passion for it and through your incredible talent. And to our audience, please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, and comment. Please send me an email at Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org with any thoughts that you have. Justin, wish you luck in everything you're doing and hope to see you again on the Scuttlebutt. I want to thank Millerstown Pick Apart for their generous support and sponsorship of this program. For Millerstown's hours, direction, inventory, and pricing, go to pickapartyard.com. That's PICAPARTYARD.com. Thank you so much, Millerstown, and we'll see you on the next Scuttlebutt.